It only remains for me to present to you, Mr. Prime Minister, these constitutional instruments which establish Kenya's independence.
On December 12, 1964, Kenya changed forever. A sea of people flooded Nairobi's streets, waving flags, singing hymns, and weeping openly as the black-red-green banner rose above Government House. At the center of it all stood a man wrapped in symbolism and contradiction, a statesman in a British suit, a freedom fighter clutching a traditional fly whisk, a leader who had once been branded an insurgent, now hailed as Baba wa Taifa, the father of the nation. This is the story of Jomo Kenyatta, not as a saint, not as a villain, but as the man who became the idea of Kenya itself. Let's get into it. The hills of Gatundu in the 1890s offered little protection from the unequal storm gathering over East Africa. Here, in the household of a minor Kikuyu headman, Kamau Wangengi drew his first breaths beneath a thatched roof already shadowed by British frontier police posts. His mother, Wambui, whispered ancestral blessings while struggling to keep her surviving children fed. Smallpox had recently claimed 2 infants, and her husband, Ngengi wa Muigai, succumbed to a fever not long afterward. The young boy, therefore, grew up in a matrilineal cocoon of widows, maternal uncles, and, most influentially, an aging grandfather, Kungu wa Gathecha, a healer versed in the curative bark of the Mugumo fig and the oracular rhythms of Kikuyu cosmology. Kungu believed every scar etched a prophecy. When Kamau gashed his knee during a goat drive, the wound festered into an infection so severe that elders prepared burial gourd rattles. Kungu, unwilling to surrender his grandson to the spirits, carried him nearly 20 miles to the newly completed Church of Scotland mission at Thogoto. There, European nurses lanced the abscess, applied carbolic acid, and, more revolutionary than any medicine, spoke to Kamau in a language of letters, numbers, and hymns. He emerged weeks later limping but alive, smelling of carbolic and paraffin, his head buzzing with the missionary's promise, "Learn our words and you will command the world." Colonial Kiambu was fast becoming the empire's coffee pantry. Survey pegs and no native trespass boards advanced across ancestral fields, pushing Kikuyu tenants into wage labor. Kamau watched dispossessed neighbors file past European estates, khaki-clad guards striking their herding staff. Each displacement story reached Kungu's veranda by night and stoked the boy's curiosity. Why did redcoats write rules the elders could not read? The answer, he suspected, lay in the leather-bound volumes stacked in the mission classroom. Thogoto's schoolmasters, stern Presbyterians with pocket watches, taught scripture, spelling, and the rudiments of carpentry. They also enforced cultural amputation. Kikuyu rites of passage were branded heathen, polygamy was condemned, and traditional healers were ridiculed as charlatans. Kamau, too pragmatic to rebel, devoured the curriculum by day, and at dusk quizzed his grandfather about spirits the missionaries dismissed. The tension between two knowledge systems forged an internal anvil, colonial literacy on one side, indigenous memory on the other. Each hammer blow produced sparks of critical thought. In August 1914, war drums rolled across Europe and echoed even in rural Kiambu. Mission records list that year as the moment Kamau received baptism, adopting the Christian forename Johnstone, a badge he would later shed. Coinciding with his baptism, he completed an apprenticeship in the compound's joinery shop, where he crafted stools for the mission dining hall and first handled imported steel tools. Yet the most significant artifact he fashioned was for himself, a broad beaded leather belt threaded with brass coils and cowrie shells. It proclaimed identity without uttering a word, Kikuyu artistry wrapped around a body now conversant in English hymns. Villagers soon nicknamed him Kenyatta, the one with the ornate belt. A symbol had been born, even though the man behind it still answered to Johnstone when summoning roll call. By 1920, drought and new taxes were strangling subsistence farming, and rumors of paying jobs in railway depots reached Gatundu. Kamau, belt fastened firmly, shouldered a small satchel, and followed iron tracks to Nairobi, a dust-blown boomtown where Africans lived in segregated barracks but could barter labor for shillings. The limping child had survived. The literate carpenter was now stepping onto a larger stage. He did not yet know that the metropolis's bustling streets would provide both a podium and a crucible, drawing him toward the first sparks of organized protest. In Nairobi's crowded alleys, the beaded belt would acquire a voice, and the name Kenyatta would begin speaking for thousands who had none. When Kamau wa Nyangi, now commonly hailed as Kenyatta, stepped off the train at Nairobi railhead in 1920, the town was barely 2 decades old, yet already divided by lines sharper than any surveyor could draw. To the north, eucalyptus shaded the white quarter of Muthaiga, where verandas sparkled with crystal tumblers of gin. To the south sprawled the ramshackle tin-roof native locations, their mud lanes perfumed by charcoal smoke and resentment. It was into this charged geography that the 26-year-old settled, hungry for wages and illumination. He lodged first in Pumwani, renting a one-room Makuti hut near the railway yards. By day, he labored as a carpenter's assistant, chiseling mahogany panels for settler clubs. At night, he attended literacy classes run by Asian merchants keen to cultivate Anglophone clerks. Their ledgers introduced him to double-entry bookkeeping and the quieter power of numbers, how a single bureaucratic column could decide whose hut would be taxed and whose herd would be seized. Armed with that insight, Kenyatta soon secured a modest post in the Nairobi Municipal Native Affairs Department, drafting memoranda and interpreting Kikuyu testimony in colonial courts. His bilingual fluency made him indispensable to magistrates, but also exposed him to a daily parade of injustices. Elders fined for grazing goats on ancestral riverbanks, suddenly labeled Crown Land. Teenage boys flogged for hawking sugarcane without a license. Each case planted a delicate thorn in his conscience. Still, Kenyatta was cautious. With a crippled father and 2 sisters now relying on his remittances, overt rebellion seemed reckless. Instead, he studied the architecture of power from within, one affidavit at a time. That caution collided head-on with history in March 1922, when the charismatic telegraph operator Harry Thuku summoned Nairobi's African workers to protest hut taxes and pass laws. Thuku's East African Association (EAA) rallied thousands outside the Norfolk Hotel, chanting, "Uria, Uria, freedom, freedom!" Kenyatta, pressed shoulder to shoulder with barbers, stevedores, and washerwomen, witnessed colonial rifles mow down at least 25 demonstrators. The massacre turned his moral frustration into flint. If literacy were a sword, it was time to draw it. Following Thuku's arrest, Kenyatta helped survivors reorganize under the quieter banner of the Kikuyu Central Association (KCA). The KCA's strategy was surgically precise. Rather than street protest, it would exploit the empire's procedural arteries: petition, deputation, printed word. When clerks could not translate land deeds, Kenyatta did. When elders faltered before English stenographers, he steadied their testimony. His deft pen and cool diction earned him election as KCA secretary in 1928. Yet paperwork alone could not bind the scattered Kikuyu ridges, so Kenyatta founded Mwigathania, He Who Brings Together, a monthly cyclo-styled newspaper printed in pure Kikuyu idiom. Every issue bypassed mission censors by disguising outrage as parable. A goat stolen here, a river fenced there, until readers recognized their dispossession inside the fable. Circulation exploded from 500 to 5,000 within a year, delivered by bicycle couriers to Nyeri, Murang'a, and even the malaria flats of Embu. The colonial press registrar tried to suspend the paper. Kenyatta responded by shifting print runs to different huts each month, turning the very act of distribution into a rehearsal for resistance. Meanwhile, the KCA executive resolved that petitions dropped into the Government House letterbox were vanishing like rain onto corrugated iron. Someone had to carry grievances directly to the heart of the empire, London. The elders hesitated. Who could debate Oxford-accented officials, navigate underground trains, and survive fog and cold mutton? Kenyatta, with his courtly English and missionary polish, fit the bill, though he had never seen the ocean. He accepted, not out of vanity, but out of mounting urgency. The High Commission had just tabled plans for a White Highlands Reserve, threatening to formalize the permanent eviction of tens of thousands of Kikuyu farmers. On 21 September 1929, correspondents recorded a curious sight at Kilindini Harbor, Mombasa. A slim man in a tattered greatcoat, clutching a battered suitcase and wearing an elaborate beaded belt beneath European trousers. As the steamer Madura's whistle shrieked, friends joked he might freeze in English drizzle. Kenyatta laughed lightly, but a colleague later recalled that his eyes burned as if already seeing a different skyline. Gray, imperial, ready to be questioned. Thus, the city that schooled him in paperwork now propelled him toward the imperial metropolis itself. But London in the 1930s wasn't just indifferent to African grievances. It was actively rewriting the map of East Africa to favor white settler rule. His earliest days were filled with rejection. The colonial office refused to meet him despite his letters and appeals. Kenyatta wandered the corridors of government buildings, clutching neatly folded petitions from the Kikuyu Central Association, only to be told that African voices had no standing in matters of imperial governance. Yet Kenyatta had learned from Thogoto and Nairobi that if the front door remained shut, you built your path in. He began speaking at Hyde Park Corner, publishing articles in radical journals, and attending community meetings organized by British workers' unions, Quakers, and socialists. Slowly, the African question became more than just an abstraction for British audiences. It had a face. A man with a proud gait, a musical accent, and eyes that could flicker between sorrow and rage in a single sentence. In these rooms, Kenyatta began encountering a generation of African and Caribbean intellectuals who were also tired of waiting for colonial mercy. At a 1930 gathering, he met George Padmore, a Trinidadian Marxist who introduced him to Pan-Africanist networks, where resistance was intellectual and global. These new alliances convinced Kenyatta that liberation required solidarity beyond borders. Even so, he understood the West admired degrees and citations more than fiery speeches. So in 1932, he did something few would expect. He went back to school. His first stop was the Moscow Lenin School, under a short-lived scholarship secured through the Comintern. Though disillusioned with Soviet-style propaganda and ideological rigidity, Kenyatta was struck by the idea that empires could be dismantled by organizing the powerless. He returned to Britain within a year, cautious but clearer. Africa didn't need imported ideologies. It needed self-definition. He enrolled at University College London and later the London School of Economics, where he studied anthropology under Bronisław Malinowski, one of the foremost thinkers of the time. Malinowski urged students to live among the people they studied. Kenyatta flipped that paradigm. He wrote Facing Mount Kenya in 1938, not as a detached observer of the Kikuyu, but as a son of the soil. The book shattered stereotypes, presenting Kikuyu traditions, initiation rites, land tenure systems, and communal living, not as primitive relics, but as complex, logical, and dignified systems. The book was revolutionary, not for what it said, but for who said it. A black man with no European degree had used academic language to expose the violence of cultural erasure. Kenyatta had weaponized anthropology against the anthropologists. But the intellectual fight wasn't enough. The 1930s brought fascism's rise, and with it, new urgency. When Hitler invaded Poland, Kenyatta stayed in England, speaking not just about Kenya, but against all forms of imperial domination. During World War II, he lived modestly, working as a farm laborer in Sussex, all while continuing to publish essays and mentor a generation of young African students arriving in Britain. In 1945, the war ended, but Kenyatta's war was only just beginning. That year, he helped organize the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, where he sat alongside W.E.B. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, Amy Ashwood Garvey, and others who declared that colonialism must end, not eventually, but now. There, on a crowded stage in a smoky hall, Kenyatta was no longer a petitioner. He was a strategist, part of a continent-wide engine of revolution. Britain may have refused to hear him in 1930. By the time Jomo Kenyatta set foot back in Kenya in September 1946, he was no longer a quiet court interpreter or village boy with a beaded belt. He was now the most educated, most internationally connected African nationalist in the colony. His speeches had echoed through the lecture halls of London, and his name had been printed alongside Du Bois and Nkrumah in the bulletins of Pan-Africanism. But while the intellectuals of Europe recognized Kenyatta as a rising African statesman, the people of Kenya welcomed him back as a symbol of hope in the flesh. The Kikuyu Highlands, where dispossession had hardened into desperation, erupted with celebration upon his arrival. Farmers trekked miles barefoot to glimpse the man who had dared confront the empire in its courts and classrooms. In Nairobi, market vendors closed their stalls and gathered in crowds. Mothers held up their children and whispered, "That's the man who went to London to fight for our land." He wasn't just a man returning from exile, he was a prophecy fulfilled. But as Kenyatta inhaled the scent of his homeland once more, he was hit with a revelation. Kenya had changed, and not for the better. The colonial machine had become more sophisticated and more brutal. Settler plantations had expanded, entire villages had been relocated, and African grievances had metastasized from whispered complaints to the brewing of something far more explosive. The landscape was dry, but the roots of rebellion were moist. He could feel it in the songs, see it in the stares, hear it in the silence of those who greeted him not with cheers, but with questions. Kenyatta moved swiftly. Within a year of his return, he assumed leadership of a new and increasingly assertive nationalist movement, the Kenya African Union, KAU. In June 1947, he was elected president. KAU was not the KCA of the old days. It was broader, bolder, and no longer afraid of confrontation. Under Kenyatta's leadership, it began organizing village meetings, printing leaflets, and challenging settler policies directly in the courts and the streets. Yet, Kenyatta walked a tightrope between revolution and restraint. He publicly preached nonviolence, negotiation, and ethnic unity, emphasizing Harambee, a Swahili term meaning, "let's all pull together." This wasn't just a slogan, it was a strategy. He knew the colonial state wanted to fracture the independence movement along tribal lines. By positioning himself above ethnic politics, Kenyatta made KAU a pan-Kenyan force. But not everyone shared his patience. In the forests of Mount Kenya, a younger, more militant generation had already begun organizing in secret. Disillusioned by decades of broken promises and fake commissions, these insurgents, many of them former soldiers who had fought for Britain in World War II and returned to find no land, no jobs, and no respect, began preparing for war. They took oaths, sharpened blades, and planned for the day the gun would speak what petitions could not. Kenyatta tried to contain the storm. He traveled the country, urging restraint. He told the angry youth that true victory would come from diplomacy, not bloodshed. But his appeals were drowning in rage. People remembered his 1930 warning in the Times. If these grievances are not addressed, a dangerous explosion is inevitable. Now, in 1950, that explosion was ticking loudly under the surface. The British, for their part, saw Kenyatta's rising influence with dread. To them, he wasn't a moderate. He was a potential kingmaker of a rebellion they could no longer predict. Intelligence files referred to him ominously as the unifying axis of African discontent. His international connections made him dangerous. His moderate tone made him even more so because it offered no excuse to detain him yet. Still, the moment was coming. Here's a quick reminder. Please like, share, and subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked for powerful Black news, real stories of our heroes and leaders, and the rich culture and history the world tried to forget. In 1952, all the cautious whispers became shouts. The Mau Mau uprising burst into the open as Kikuyu guerrilla fighters launched attacks against settler farms, police outposts, and African loyalist chiefs. Panic seized colonial Nairobi. British settlers began evacuating their families. The air reeked of smoke, both from the forests and from the fear in Government House. The colonial response was swift. A state of emergency was declared in October. Just days later, Jomo Kenyatta was arrested along with 5 other KAU leaders. The charge? Masterminding the Mau Mau rebellion. Though the evidence was flimsy, the symbolism was perfect. Kenyatta's name was now tied fairly or unfairly to the blood-stained uprising that had shaken the empire to its bones. And so began the next chapter of his life. Not as a politician or a freedom fighter, but as a prisoner of the empire. Yet even behind bars, the spear would not break. When the British arrested Jomo Kenyatta in October 1952, they weren't just detaining a man, they were trying to neutralize a myth. Thus began the infamous Kapenguria trial, one of the most politically charged and legally dubious court cases in colonial African history. Held far from Nairobi, in the remote northern outpost of Kapenguria, the trial was designed as much for optics as for justice. Kenyatta and 5 other KAU leaders, Bildad Kagia, Kungu Karumba, Fred Kubai, Paul Nye, and Achieng Oneko, stood accused of being the inner circle of Mau Mau. The colonial press dubbed them the Kapenguria Six, but only one name truly mattered to the prosecution: Kenyatta. The trial's centerpiece was a mysterious witness named Rawson Makaria, who claimed he had seen Kenyatta administer a Mau Mau oath. Years later, it would emerge that Makaria had been coached, paid, and promised education abroad by the colonial government. But at the time, his testimony, however inconsistent, was enough for the British to convict. The judge's summation was blunt. Kenyatta, he declared, was the leader unto darkness and death. The sentence, 7 years of hard labor, followed by indefinite restriction of movement. It was not just a verdict, it was a political statement. The colonial state believed that by caging Kenyatta, they would kill the idea of Kenyan nationalism. They couldn't have been more wrong. Kenyatta was sent first to Lokotong, a desolate prison camp on Kenya's arid northern frontier. There, miles from his homeland, from political life and the public eye, he was forced into hard labor in blistering heat. Yet, in isolation, his legend only grew. He maintained a regal composure, wore his prison uniform like a statesman's robe, and even began teaching fellow inmates about history, politics, and philosophy. Guards who had been instructed to break him reported back that he was calm, disciplined, and utterly unshakable. By 1959, Kenyatta's prison sentence had been completed, but he wasn't free. The colonial government transferred him to Lodwar, a remote desert town, and placed him under house arrest. Isolated and monitored, he was forbidden from engaging in politics, giving public statements, or even traveling to Nairobi. Still, emissaries came. Elders, activists, and young nationalists made the treacherous journey to the edge of the desert, seeking his blessing, his wisdom, or simply to see for themselves if the old man still stood. He did. Back in the cities, the ground was shifting. The Mau Mau had been militarily crushed by 1956, but the cost was staggering. Thousands dead, entire communities uprooted, and British global credibility in shambles. Meanwhile, a younger generation of African nationalists, more cautious, better organized, and inspired by Kenyatta's dignity under fire, took the mantle of resistance. In 1960, as constitutional talks loomed, these nationalists nationalists formed the Kenya African National Union (KANU) and elected Kenyatta as its president in absentia. It was a political earthquake. With this move, they declared there would be no future for Kenya unless it included the man the empire had tried to erase. By now, the winds of decolonization were sweeping through Africa. Britain's hold was loosening. Pressure from the international community, especially India and other newly independent nations, mounted. Within Kenya itself, settler confidence was eroding, and colonial administrators knew they could no longer exclude the man whose name had become synonymous with the nation's destiny. On August 14, 1961, Kenyatta was quietly reunited with his family in Gatundu. A week later, on August 21st, the colonial administration officially lifted his restrictions. After nearly 9 years, Jomo Kenyatta was free. He emerged older, yes, but more revered than ever. Jomo Kenyatta's first public appearance after 9 years of forced silence was staged in Nairobi's Kaloleni grounds on a cloudless Sunday in late October 1961. Tens of thousands squeezed onto the football pitch, climbing eucalyptus trunks for a glimpse of the man the empire had tried to bury in desert dust. When he finally spoke, the voice was gravelly but measured. Shed bitterness. Build the nation. The struggle's lesson is unity. It was an appeal forged in solitude, aimed at transforming shared grievance into shared purpose, and it landed with thunderous applause that rattled the tin roofs of nearby Pumwani. Yet Kenyatta knew euphoria alone could not dismantle the intricate scaffolding of colonial rule. Within days, he convened KANU's executive in a rented Ngara hall, laying out a blueprint that startled even loyalists. No mass expulsions of Europeans, no wholesale nationalizations, and unequivocal outreach to non-Kikuyu parties. This was not timidity, it was political jujitsu. By assuring minority communities and foreign investors of their place in a future Kenya, he robbed hardline settlers of the fear needed to justify another crackdown. Opposition surfaced quickly from both flanks. On the right, white settlers branded him a wolf in sheepskin. On the left, young militants who had tasted guerrilla life accused him of capitulation. Meanwhile, ethnic fault lines widened when Ronald Ngala's coastal-based Kenya African Democratic Union, KADU, demanded a federal Majimbo constitution to check Kikuyu and Luo dominance. Kenyatta responded the same way he had in London cafes a decade earlier, with patient negotiation girded by moral theater. He toured Rift Valley barazas, flanked by Luo Ali Tom Mboya, raising clasped hands before Kalenjin, Maasai, and Luhya crowds, dramatizing the cost of disunity. Every rally ended with the same Swahili refrain, "Harambee! Let us all pull together." The domestic charm offensive set the stage for the Lancaster House Conference of early 1962. Kenyatta entered the walnut-paneled committee room in Westminster, not as a supplicant, but as president-designate of a party commanding 2/3 of Kenya's African districts. He carried 3 non-negotiables: majority rule, a Bill of Rights to calm minorities, and a phased handover of security. Behind the scenes, he cut a deal so deft that even British negotiator Ian MacLeod would later call him annoyingly reasonable. Kenyatta ceded certain provincial powers to mollify KADU, while London agreed to quick elections and a timetable for independence. Crucially, Britain earmarked £25 million for a land buyout scheme, money Kenyatta saw as lubricant for post-settler reconciliation. The May 1963 general election became the referendum on that compromise. KANU won 83 of 124 elective seats. KADU mustered 31. The magnitude of victory startled colonial administrators who had banked on a hung assembly. On June 1, 1963, Madaraka Day, Kenyatta was sworn in as Prime Minister of a self-governing Kenya. His inaugural address mixed absolution and admonition. We forgive, but we shall not forget. We stretch our hand, but we shall not falter in defending our birthright. To underscore continuity, he retained several senior British civil servants, even inviting the outgoing governor, Sir Patrick Renison, to stay on as an advisor for 6 months. Over the next half-year, Kenyatta governed in constitutional twilight, neither colony nor republic. He pushed urgent legislation, dismantling racial passbooks, integrating schools, and launching the first tranche of land purchases in the fertile White Highlands. At the same time, he courted East African neighbors, signing provisional pacts with Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika and Milton Obote of Uganda for a customs union, laying economic rails he hoped would outlast colonial tracts. Then, at midnight on the 12th of December, 1963, fireworks arched above Nairobi as the Union Jack eased down and Kenya's black, red, green rose. Kenyatta, clad in a goatskin cloak gifted by Maasai elders, watched unsmiling, the weight of promise heavier than celebration. Exactly 1 year later, the new constitution abolished the post of Governor-General, and Kenya declared itself a republic. Parliament elected Kenyatta its first president. The boy who once limped to a mission clinic had, in just 3 years of frenetic statecraft, shepherded a fragmented territory through negotiation, election, and emancipation. Now the task shifted from gaining power to wielding it. To transform slogans of unity into policies of growth without fracturing the delicate coalitions that had carried him this far. When Kenya officially became a republic on December 12, 1964, and Jomo Kenyatta was sworn in as its first president, it was not merely a ceremonial milestone. It marked the beginning of an era where one man's voice would increasingly be indistinguishable from the state itself. The celebrations, synchronized parades, choirs in every district, and livestock feasts in villages were as much about hope as they were about consolidation. For Kenyatta, power was no longer a dream deferred or a right denied. Now it was in his hands, and he had every intention of keeping it there. The first years of Kenyatta's presidency were defined by stability, ambition, and centralization. His leadership radiated a paternal aura. Ministers addressed him as Mzee, the old man, a title of reverence that quickly acquired constitutional weight. Cabinet meetings became ritualistic affirmations of presidential will. Parliament, though active, increasingly took its cues from the State House. In public rallies, Kenyatta stood with his fly whisk raised like a baton of unity. In private, he maneuvered with the precision of a chess master, shuffling portfolios, rewarding loyalty, and neutralizing dissent through appointments or quiet exile. But while power concentrated, so did progress. Kenya, unlike many newly independent African states, did not collapse into tribal violence or economic chaos. That was not accidental. It was Kenyatta's design. His government embarked on massive Africanization programs. Public service posts, once reserved for Europeans, were handed to educated Africans. Financial institutions like Kenya Commercial Bank and the Industrial and Commercial Development Corporation, ICDC, were reoriented to support African entrepreneurs. Schools multiplied, hospitals were constructed, and the new University of Nairobi became the intellectual spine of the republic. In the final years of his presidency, Jomo Kenyatta presided over a Kenya that stood apart from much of Africa. While coups toppled governments from Accra to Kampala, Kenya remained steady. Its economy was growing, its roads extended further, and its classrooms filled with the children of independence. Tourists came, investors stayed, and diplomats listened. Kenyatta had turned a fragile post-colonial state into one of the most stable nations on the continent. Yet this stability came with a cost. As power was centralized in Nairobi and within Kenyatta's inner circle, dissent became more difficult and political space narrowed. Loyalists were elevated, critics were sidelined. The old revolutionary had become the guardian of order, but many ordinary Kenyans looked past the politics. They saw a man who had kept the country intact, who had given them peace and who, for better or worse, had guided Kenya into modernity. Then, on August 22, 1978, Jomo Kenyatta died peacefully in his sleep at the coastal state house in Mombasa. The nation froze. The mourning was immediate, deep, and genuine. Streets fell silent, markets closed, and across the country, from city squares to village compounds, people wept for the man they called Mzee. Flags flew at half-mast. Schools halted. The heart of a nation had stopped. At his funeral, thousands lined up to pay their last respects. Leaders from across the world came to honor him, and the country buried him beside Parliament, where his statue still watches over the seat of government. But his presence did not end there. Jomo Kenyatta's journey from a barefoot boy in Gatundu to the first president of Kenya is one of the greatest African stories ever told. He fought empires with ideas. He carried the dreams of millions. He made mistakes, yes, but he also made a country. His name lives on in every schoolchild who carries a Kenyan flag, in every road built through once-forgotten towns, in every citizen who calls this land home. More than 4 decades after his death, his legacy still shapes the soul of Kenya. He was not perfect, but he was monumental. And in the end, Kenyatta did not just lead Kenya, he became its foundation. Is Kenya still following Kenyatta? Let us know in the comment section. As Kenya continues to evolve, is it time to celebrate Kenyatta more or to question him more deeply? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it, because here we tell the stories no one else will. From ancient African civilizations to modern Black excellence, we reveal the truth, the power, and the legacy they tried to erase. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.